You can hear all my audiobooks, including those not shared on YouTube, by following the links below at Gumroad and Patreon. Thank you for your support. The Question Concerning Technology in China. An essay in Cosmotechnics by Yuk Hui. When I hear modern people complain of being lonely, then I know what has happened. They have lost the cosmos. D.H. Lawrence, Apocalypse. If communism in China should come to rule, one can assume that only in this way will China become free for technology. What is this process? M. Heidegger. For Bernard, 2016. Preface. Quite a few of the notes to which I returned in writing this book date from my teenage years, when I was fascinated both by the cosmogony of Neo-Confucianism and by contemporary astrophysics. I remember how, over several summers, I went regularly every week to the Central Library in Kowloon with my brother Ben and brought home piles of books on physics and metaphysics, spending all day reading things that were beyond me and which at the time I didn't know how to use. Luckily, I profited from many discussions with my literature and calligraphy teacher, Dr. Lai Kwang-peng, who introduced me to the thought of the new Confucian philosopher Mou Zongsan, 1909 to 1995, his PhD supervisor at that time. When I started studying Western philosophy, especially contemporary thought, I confronted the great difficulty of integrating it with what I had learned in the past without falling prey to a superficial and exotic comparison. In 2009, an encounter with the work of Keiji Nishitani and Bernard Stiegler on Heidegger suggested to me a way to approach the different philosophical systems from the perspective of the question of time. More recently, while reading the works of anthropologist Philippe Descola and Chinese philosopher Li Sanhu, I began to formulate a concrete question. If one admits that there are multiple natures, is it possible to think of multiple technics, which are different from each other not simply functionally and aesthetically, but also ontologically and cosmologically? This is the principal question of the current work. I propose what I call cosmotechnics as an attempt to open up the question of technology and its history, which for various reasons has been closed down over the last century. There are many people to whom I would like to express my gratitude, members of the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft Research Group, Mediale Telabe, Professor Bette Oshner, Professor Urs Steheli, Professor Elke Bippus, Professor Isabel Otto, Marcus Spohr, Robert Stock, Sebastian Dietrich, Milan Sturmer, and especially Prof. Eric Horrell for generously hosting this project and for the discussions, the China Academy of Art for supporting the production of this book, and for discussions with Professor Gao Shiming, Professor Guan Hua Bin, Professor Huang Sun Chuan, Johnson Chang, Lu Rui Yang, Wei Shan, Jiang Jun, Yao Yu Chun, Zhang Shunren, Zhou Jing, members of the Pharmacon Philosophy School, Anne Albert, Sarah Baranzoni, Anis Noni, Paolo Vignola, Paul Emile Jeffrey, Michael Cressevier, Francois Cobissier, Axel Anderson, Caroline Stiegler, Elisa Stiegler, Augustine Stiegler, Paul Villamark, also for his introduction to the work of Rudolf Bohm, colleagues and friends with whom I've had inspiring discussions, Howard Cagle, Scott Lash, Jean Hughes Barthélemy, Vincent Bontemps, Louis Morel, Luis Piguet, Tristan Garcia, Vincent Normand, Adina May, Regula Boer, Natalie Skatolin, Gio Skatolin, Alexander Monin, Pieter Lemons, Armand Beverungen, Marcel Mars, Martina Leaker, Andres Brockman, Holger Fath, Cecil Dupacquier, Jeffrey Shaw, Hector Rodriguez, Linda Lai, Professor Zhang Yiben, Eiko Honda. I would also like to thank Robin McKay and Damian Veal for their great editorial work, critical comments, and invaluable suggestions. Lastly, I want to thank Bernard Stiegler for the generous discussions and inspirations over the past years. Yuk Hui, Berlin, Summer 2016. Timeline of thinkers, East and West, discussed in the book. East, Prehistory, Fu Xi, Nu Hua, Shen Nong, Yan Di, Lie Shan Shi. 1766 to 1122 BC, Shang Dynasty. No thinkers listed. 1122 to 256 BC, Zhou Dynasty. Lao Tzu, unknown to 531 BC. Confucius, 551 to 479 BC. Mo Tzu, 470 to 391 BC. Zhuangzi, 370 to 287 BC. Mencius, 372 to 289 BC. Xunzi, 313 to 238 BC. 221 to 207 BC. Qin Dynasty, no thinkers listed. 206 BC to 220 CE, Han Dynasty. Liu An, 179 to 122 BC. Dong Zhongshu, 179 to 104 BC. Sima Qian, 145 to 90 BC. Zheng Xuan, 127 to 200 CE. 220 to 589 CE, 6 dynasties. 3 kingdoms, 220 to 265 CE. Jin Dynasty, 265 to 420 CE. Northern and Southern Dynasties, 386 to 589 CE. Wang Bi, 226 to 249. Guo Xiang, 252 to 312. 589 to 618, Sui Dynasty, no thinkers listed. 618 to 907, Tang Dynasty, Han Yu, 768 to 824. Liu Zongyuan, 773 to 819. Hongren, 601 to 685. Shen Xiu, 606 to 706. He Nuang, 638 to 713. 907 to 960, 5 dynasties, no thinkers listed. 960 to 1270, Song Dynasty. Northern Song, 960 to 1127. Southern Song, 1127 to 1279. Zhou Dunyi, 1017 to 1073. Zhang Zai, 1020 to 1077. Cheng Hao, 1032 to 1085. Chen Yi, 1033 to 1107. Xiao Yong, 1011 to 1077. Zhu Xi, 1130 to 1200. 1279 to 1368, Yuan Dynasty, no thinkers listed. 1368 to 1644, Ming Dynasty. Wang Yang Ming, 1472 to 1529. Song Ying Xing, 1587 to 1666. 1644 to 1911, Qing Dynasty. Wang Fuzhi, 1619 to 1692. Dai Zhen, 1724 to 1777. Duan Yu Cai, 1735 to 1815. Zhang Xuecheng, 1738 to 1801. Gong Zizhen, 1792 to 1841. Wei Yuan, 1795 to 1856. Yan Fu, 1894 to 1921. Kang Youwei, 1858 to 1927. Tan Si Tong, 1865 to 1898. Wu Zhi Hui, 1865 to 1953. Wang Guo Wei, 1877 to 1927. 1912 to 1949, Republic of China. Chen Duxiu, 1879 to 1942. Xiangshi Li, 1885 to 1968. Chang Teng Sun, 1886 to 1973. Carson Chang, 1887 to 1968. Ding Wen Jiang, 1887 to 1936. Hu Shi, 1891 to 1962. Shi De Shan, 1893 to 1941, Feng Youlan, 1895 to 1990, Mou Zongsan, 1909 to 1995, Zhang Dainian, 1909 to 2004, Yu Guangyuan, 1915-2013, Lao Siquang, 1927 to 2012, Li Ziho, 1930 to the present, Yu Yingshi, 1930 to the present, Chen Changshu, 1932 to 2011, Liu Shu Xin, 1934 to 2016, Tu Weiming, 1940 to the present. Thinkers of the West. Salon, 640 to 558 BC. Thales, 1624 to 546 BC. Anaximander, 610 to 546 BC. Heraclitus, 535 to 475 BC. Parmenides, 515 to 450 BC. Sophocles, 497 or 496 to 406 or 405 BC. Socrates, 470 or 469 to 399 BC. Plato, 428 or 427 to 348 or 347 BC. Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC. Euclid, 300 BC. Archimedes, 287 to 212 BC. Zeno of Citium, 334 to 262 BC. Clinthus, 330 to 230 BC. Chrysippus of Soli, 279 to 206 BC. Cicero, 106 to 43 BC. Seneca, 1 to 65 CE. Claudius Ptolemy, 100 to 170. Marcus Aurelius, 121 to 180. Pappus of Alexandria, 290 to 350. Diogenes Laertes, 3rd century. Augustine, 354 to 430. Boethius, 480 to 524. Adelard of Bath, 1080 to 1152. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274. Nicholas of Cusa, 1401 to 1464. Bartholomew Zamberti, 1473 to 1543. Nicholas Copernicus, 1473 to 1533. Tycho Brahe, 1546 to 1601. Francisco Suarez, 1548 to 1670. Galileo Galilei, 1564 to 1642. Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630. René Descartes, 1596 to 1650. Baruch Spinoza, 1632 to 1677. Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 1646 to 1716. Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831. Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling, 1775 to 1854. Friedrich Hölderlin, 1770 to 1842. Ernst Christian Kopp, 1808 to 1896. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900. Edmund Husserl, 1859 to 1938. Henry Bergson, 1859 to 1892. Friedrich Dessauer, 1881 to 1936. Sigmund Freud, 1886 to 1939. Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976. Herbert Marcuse, 1898 to 1979. André Leroy-Gourhan, 1911 to 1986. Jacques Elway, 1912 to 1994. Jean-Pierre Vernat, 1914 to 2007. Gilbert Simondon, 1924 to 1989. Jean-Francois Lyotard, 1924 to 1998. Jürgen Habermas, 1929 to the present. Jacques Derrida, 1930 to 2004. Alain Badiou, 1937 to the present. Peter Sloterdijk, 1947 to the present. Bernard Stiegler, 1952 to the present. Introduction. In 1953, Martin Heidegger delivered his famous lecture, Die Frage nach der Technik. Martin Heidegger, The Question Concerning Technology, in The Question Concerning Technology and Other Essays, translated by W. Lovett, in which he announced that the essence of modern technology is nothing technological, but rather in framing, a transformation of the relation between man and the world, such that every being is reduced to the status of standing reserve or stock, something that can be measured, calculated, and exploited. Heidegger's critique of modern technology opened up a new awareness of technological power, which had already been interrogated by fellow German writers such as Ernst Jünger and Oswald Spengler. Heidegger's writings followed the turn in his thought, usually dated around 1930, and this text in particular portrayed the shift from techne as poiesis, or bringing forth, to technology as Gestell, seen as a necessary consequence of Western metaphysics, and a destiny which demands a new form of thinking, the thinking of the question of the truth of being. Heidegger's critique found a receptive audience among Eastern thinkers. Footnote, in this book by East, I generally mean East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, etc., countries that were influenced by Confucianism, Buddhism, and to some degree Taoism. End of footnote. Most notably in the teachings of the Kyoto school, as well as in the Taoist critique of technical rationality, which identifies Heidegger's Gelassenheit with the classical Taoist concept of Wu Wei, or non-action. This receptivity is understandable for several reasons. Firstly, Heidegger's pronouncements regarding the power and dangers of modern technology seemed to have been substantiated by the devastations of war, industrialization, and mass consumerism, leading to interpretations of his thought as a kind of existentialist humanism, as in the mid-century writings of Jean-Paul Sartre. Such interpretations resonated deeply with the anxieties and sense of alienation aroused by the rapid industrial and technological transformations in modern China. Secondly, Heidegger's meditations echoed Spengler's claim about the decline of Western civilization, though in a more profound key, meaning that they could be taken up as a pretext for the affirmation of Eastern values. Such an affirmation, however, engenders an ambiguous and problematic understanding of the question of technics and technology and, with the arguable exception of post-colonial theories, has prevented the emergence of any truly original thinking on the subject in the East. For it implies a tacit acceptance that there is only one kind of technics and a technology. Footnote, I make a distinction between the use of the words technics, techne, and technology. Technics refers to the general category of all forms of making and practice. Techne refers to the Greek conception of it, which Heidegger understands as poiesis, or bringing forth, and technology refers to a radical turn, which took place during European modernity and developed in the direction of ever-increasing automation, leading consequently to what Heidegger calls the Gestell. End of footnote. In the sense that the latter are deemed to be anthropologically universal, that they have the same functions across cultures and hence must be explained in the same terms. Heidegger himself was no exception to the tendency to understand both technology and science as international, in contrast to thinking, which is not international but unique and homely. In the recently published Black Notebooks, Heidegger wrote, "The sciences, like technology and like the technical schools, Techniken, are necessarily international. An international thinking does not exist, only the universal thinking coming from one source. However, if it is to remain close to the origin, it requires a fateful dwelling in a unique home and the unique people, so that it is not the folkish purpose of thinking and the mere expression of people, the respective, only fateful home of the down-to-earthness is the rooting, which alone can enable growth into the universal." This statement demands further analysis. Firstly, the relation between thinking and technics in Heidegger's own thought needs to be elucidated. And secondly, the problematic of the homecoming of philosophy as a turning against technology needs to be examined. However, it is clear here that Heidegger sees technology as something detachable from its cultural source, already international, and which therefore has to be overcome by thinking. In the same Black Notebook, Heidegger commented on technological development in China, anticipating the victory of the Communist Party. Footnote, this was written between 1942 and 1948. The Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949. End of footnote. In a remark that seems to hint at the failure to address the question concerning technology in China in the decades that would follow the party's rise to power. Quote, if communism in China should come to rule, then one can assume that only in this way does China become free for technology. What is this process? End quote. What does becoming free for technology mean here, if not to fall prey to an inability to reflect upon it and to transform it? And indeed, a lack of reflection upon the question of technology in the East has prevented the emergence of any genuine critique originating from its own cultures, something truly symptomatic of a detachment between thinking and technology, similar to that which Heidegger described during the 1940s in Europe. And yet, if China, in addressing this question, relies on Heidegger's fundamentally Occidental analysis of the history of technics, we will reach an impasse, and this, unfortunately, is where we stand today. So, what is the question concerning technology for non-European cultures prior to modernization? Is it the same question as that of the West prior to modernization, the question of Greek techne? Furthermore, if Heidegger was able to retrieve the question of being from the Seinvergessenheit of Western metaphysics, and if today Bernard Stiegler can retrieve the question of time from the long oubli de la technique in Western philosophy, what might non-Europeans aspire to? If these questions are not even posed, then philosophy of technology in China will continue to be entirely dependent upon the work of German philosophers such as Heidegger, Ernst Kopp, Friedrich Dessauer, Herbert Marcuse, and Jürgen Habermas, and American thinkers such as Carl Mitchum, Don Ida, and Albert Borgman, and French thinkers such as Jacques Ellul, Gilbert Simondon, and Bernard Stiegler. It seems incapable of moving forward or even backward. I believe that there is an urgent need to envision and develop a philosophy of technology in China for both historical and political reasons. China has modernized itself over the past century in order to catch up with the UK and outstrip the US, a slogan proposed by Mao Zedong in 1957. Now, it seems to be at a turning point, its modernization having reached a level that allows China to situate itself among the great powers. But at the same time, there is a general sentiment that China cannot continue with this blind modernization. The great acceleration that has taken place in recent decades has also led to various forms of destruction, cultural, environmental, social, and political. We are now, so geologists tell us, living in a new epoch, that of the Anthropocene, which began roughly in the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution. Surviving the Anthropocene will demand reflection upon and transformation of the practices inherited from the modern in order to overcome modernity itself. The reconstruction of the question of technology in China outlined here also pertains to this task, aiming to unfold the concept of technics in its plurality and to act as an antidote to the modernization program by reopening a truly global history of the world. The book is an attempt both to respond to Heidegger's concept of technics and to sketch out a possible way to construct a properly Chinese philosophy of technology. The becoming of Prometheus. Is there technological thought in China? At first glance, this is a question that can be easily dismissed, for what culture doesn't have technics? Certainly, technics has existed in China for many centuries if we understand the concept to denote skills for making artificial products. But responding to this question more fully will require a deeper appreciation of what is at stake in the question of technics. In the evolution of human as Homo faber, the moment of the liberation of the hands also marks the beginning of systematic and transmissible practices of making. They emerge firstly from the need for survival, to make fire, to hunt, to build dwellings. Later, as certain skills are gradually mastered so as to improve living conditions, more sophisticated techniques can be developed. As French anthropologist and paleontologist André Leroy-Gourhan has argued, at the moment of the liberation of the hands, a long history of evolution opened up by way of the exteriorization of organs and memory and the interiorization of prostheses. Footnote: A. Leroy-Gourhan, Gesture and Speech, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and London, MIT Press, 1993. End of footnote. Now, within this universal technical tendency, we observe a diversification of artifacts across different cultures. This diversification is caused by cultural specificities, but also reinforces them in a kind of feedback loop. Leroy Gorhan calls these specificities technical facts. While a technical tendency is necessary, technical facts are accidental. As Leroy Gorhan writes, they result from the encounter of the tendency and thousands of coincidences of the milieu. While the invention of the wheel is a technical tendency, whether or not wheels will have spokes is a matter of technical fact. The early days of the science of making are dominated by the technical tendency, meaning that what reveals itself in human activities, for example in the invention of primitive wheels and the use of flint, are optimal natural efficiencies. It is only later on that cultural specificities or technical facts begin to impose themselves more distinctly. Leroy Gorhan's distinction between technical tendency and technical fact thus seeks to provide an explanation for the similarities and differences between technical inventions across different cultures. It sets out from a universal understanding of the process of hominization, characterized by the technical tendency of invention, as well as the extension of human organs through technical apparatuses. But how effective is this model in explaining the diversification of technologies throughout the world, and the different pace at which invention proceeds in different cultures? It is in light of these questions that I hope to bring into the discussion the dimensions of cosmology and metaphysics, which Leroy Gorhan himself rarely discussed. Here is my hypothesis, one which may appear rather surprising to some readers. In China, technics in the sense we understand it today, or at least as it is defined by certain European philosophers, never existed. There is a general misconception that all techniques are equal, that all skills and artificial products coming from all cultures can be reduced to one thing called technology, and indeed it is almost impossible to deny that techniques can be understood as the extension of the body or the exteriorization of memory, yet they may not be perceived or reflected upon in the same way in different cultures. To put it differently, techniques as a general human activity has been present on Earth since the time of the Australopithecus, but the philosophical concept of techniques cannot be assumed to be universal. The techniques we refer to here is one that is the subject of philosophy, meaning that it is rendered visible through the birth of philosophy. Understood as such as a philosophical category, techniques is also subject to the history of philosophy and is defined by particular interrogative perspectives. What we mean by philosophy of technology in this book is not exactly what in German is known as Technikphilosophie, associated with figures such as Ernst Kopp and Friedrich Dossauer. Rather, it appears with the birth of Hellenic philosophy and constitutes one of philosophy's core inquiries, and techniques thus understood as an ontological category, I will argue, must be interrogated in relation to a larger configuration, a cosmology proper to the culture from which it emerged. We know that the birth of philosophy in ancient Greece, as exhibited in the thinking of Thales and Anaximander, was a process of rationalization marking a gradual separation between myth and philosophy. Mythology is the source and the essential component of European philosophy, which distanced itself from mythology by naturalizing the divine and integrating it as a supplement to rationality. A rationalist may well argue that any recourse to mythology is a regression and that philosophy has been able to completely free itself from its mythological origins, yet I doubt that such a philosophy exists or ever will. We know that this opposition between mythos and logos was explicit in the Athenian Academy. Aristotle was very critical of the theologians of the school of Hesiod, and Plato before him argued relentlessly against myth. Through the mouth of Socrates in the Phaedo, he says that mythos is not his concern, but rather the affairs of the poets, portrayed as liars in the Republic. And yet, as Jean-Pierre Vernant has clearly shown, Plato grants an important place in his writings to myth as a means of expressing both those things that lie beyond and those that fall short of strictly philosophical language. Footnote, J.P. Vernant, Myth and Society in Ancient Greece, translator J. Lloyd, New York Zone Books, 1990, pages 210 to 211, end of footnote. Philosophy is not the language of blind causal necessity, but rather that which at once allows the latter to be spoken and goes beyond it. The dialectical movement between rationality and myth constitutes the dynamic of philosophy, without which there would be only positive sciences. The Romantics and German idealists writing toward the end of the 18th century, were aware of this problematic relationship between philosophy and myth. Thus, we read, in the oldest system program of German idealism, published anonymously in 1797, but whose authors are suspected to be, or at least to be associated with, the three friends from the Tübingen Stift, Hölderlin, Hegel, and Schelling, that mythology must become philosophical and the people rational, and philosophy must become mythological in order to make philosophers sensuous. Then eternal unity reigns among us. Footnote: the oldest system program of German idealism. Translator E. Forster, European Journal of Philosophy, 3, 1995, pages 199 to 200. End of footnote. Not coincidentally, this insight came at a moment of renewal of philosophical interest in Greek tragedy, chiefly through the works of these three highly influential friends. The implication here is that, in Europe, philosophy's attempt to separate itself from mythology is precisely conditioned by mythology, meaning that mythology reveals the germinal form of such a mode of philosophizing. Every demythologization is accompanied by a remythologization, since philosophy is conditioned by an origin from which it can never fully detach itself. Accordingly, in order to interrogate what is at stake in the question of technology, we should turn to the predominant myths of the origins of technology that have been handed down to us, and at once rejected and extended by Western philosophy. The misconception that technics can be considered as some kind of universal remains a huge obstacle to understanding the global technological condition in general, and in particular the challenge it poses to non-European cultures. Without an understanding of this question, we will all remain at a loss, overwhelmed by the homogeneous becoming of modern technology. Some recent work has attempted to reclaim what it calls Prometheanism, decoupling the social critique of capitalism from a degeneration of technology and affirming the power of technology to liberate us from the strictures and contradictions of modernity. This doctrine is often identified with, or at least closely related to, the notion of accelerationism. Footnote, see R. McKay and A. Avanesian, editors, #Accelerate, The Accelerationist Reader, Falmouth and Berlin, Urbanomic Merv, 2011, especially Ray Brassier's essay, Prometheanism and Its Critics, 469 to 487, end of footnote. But if such a response to technology and capitalism is applied globally as if Prometheus were a universal cultural figure, it risks perpetuating a more subtle form of colonialism. So, who is Prometheus, and what does Prometheanism stand for? Footnote. According to Ulrich von Wilhelmowitz-Moellendorff, there are two identities of Prometheus. One, Ionian Attic Prometheus, god of the fire industries, the potter and metal worker honored in the festival of the Prometheia. And two, Boeotian Locrian Prometheus, the Titan, whose punishment is part of the great theme of conflict between different generations of the gods. See J.P. Vernet, Myth and Thought Among the Greeks, New York Zone Books, 2006, page 264, end of footnote. In Plato's Protagoras, the sophist tells the story of the Titan Prometheus, also said to be the creator of human beings, who was asked by Zeus to distribute skills to all living beings. His brother Epithemius took over the job, but having distributed all the skills, found that he had forgotten to provide for human beings. In order to compensate for the fault of his brother Epithemius, Prometheus stole fire from the gods Hephaestus and bestowed it upon man. Footnote, Plato, Protagoras. Translator, S. Lombardo and K. Bell in J.M. Cooper, editor, Complete Works, Indianapolis, Indiana, Hackett, 1997, 320C to 328D. End of footnote. Hesiod told another, slightly different version of the story in his Theogony, in which the Titan challenged the omnipotence of Zeus by playing a trick with his sacrificial offering. Zeus expressed his anger by hiding fire and the means of living from human beings, in revenge for which Prometheus stole fire. Prometheus received his punishment from Zeus. He was chained to the cliff, and an eagle from Hephaestus came to eat his liver during the daytime and allowed it to grow back at night. The story continues in Works and Days, where Zeus, angered by Prometheus's deception or fraud, revenges himself by visiting evil upon human beings. This evil, or dolos, is called Pandora. Footnote, Vernat emphasizes both acts of Prometheus and Zeus as dolos. See Vernant, Myth and Society, page 185. End of footnote. The figure of Pandora, whose name means she who gives everything, is twofold. Firstly, she stands for fertility, since in another ancient account, according to Vernant, she has another name, Anisidora, the goddess of the earth. Footnote, Vernant, Myth and Thought, 266, end of footnote. Secondly, she stands for idleness and dissipation, since she is a gaster, an insatiable belly devouring the bios or nourishment that men procure for themselves through their labor. It is only in Aeschylus that Prometheus becomes the father of all technics and the master of all crafts. Whereas before he was the one who stole fire, hiding it in the hollow of a reed. Before Prometheus's invention of technics, human beings were not sensible beings, since they saw without seeing, listened without hearing, and lived in disorder and confusion. In Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, the Titan declares that all the techni that mortals have come from Prometheus. What exactly are these techni? It would be difficult to exhaust all possible meanings of the word, but it is worth paying attention to what Prometheus says, quote, "What's more, for them I invented number, wisdom above all others, and the painstaking putting together of letters, to be their memory of everything, to be their muse's mother, their handmaid." Footnote, Aeschylus, Prometheus Bound. Translators C. Harrington and J. Scully, New York, Oxford University Press, 1989, 441-506. Quoted by D. Rorschach, Of Art and Wisdom, Plato's Understanding of the Techne, University Park, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania State University Press, 1996, page 33. End of footnote. In assuming a universal Prometheanism, one assumes that all cultures arise from techne, which is originally Greek, but in China we find another mythology concerning the creation of human beings and the origin of technics, one in which there is no Promethean figure. It tells instead of three ancient emperors who were leaders of ancient tribes, Fuxi, Nuwa, and Shen Nong. Footnote, there are various accounts of who the three emperors were. The list here is the most commonly used. End of footnote. The female goddess Nuwa, who is represented as a half-human, half-snake figure, created human beings from clay. Footnote, concerning the use of clay, different versions of the tale exist. For example, according to the Huainanzi, the creation of humans was not only the work of Nuwa, but a collective work with other gods. The Yellow Emperor produced yin and yang, Shangpian produced ears and eyes, Sang Lin produced shoulders and arms. Nuwa used these to carry out the 70 transformations. J.S. Major, S.A. Queen, A.S. Meyer, and H.D. Roth, editors, translators. The Huainanzi, A Guide to the Theory and Practice of Government in Early Han China, Liu An King of Huainan, New York, Columbia University Press, 2010. End of footnote. Nuwa's brother and later husband is Fuxi, a half-dragon, half-human figure who invented the Bagua, the 8 trigrams based on a binary structure. Several classical texts document the process whereby Nuwa used 5 colored stones to repair the sky in order to stop the water flooding in great expanses and fire blazing out of control. Footnote, see the Huainanzi, Chapter 6, Surveying Obscurities. End of footnote. Shen Nong has quite an ambiguous identity, since he is often associated with 2 other names, Yan Di and Lie Shan Shi. Footnote, Li Guimin, the relation between Shen Nong, Lie Shan, and Yan Di and their recognition in antiquity. Theory Journal, March 2012. End of footnote. In this association, Shen Nong, which literally means divine farmer, is also the god of fire, and after his death, becomes the god of the kitchen. The character Yan consists of 2 repeated instances of the character for fire. It is recognized by historians that it most likely comes from the use of fire in the household rather than sun worship. Footnote, Ibid. End of footnote. As the name indicates, Shennong also invented agriculture, medicine, and other techniques. According to the Huainan Zi, an ancient Chinese text originating in a series of scholarly debates held at the court of Liuan, king of Huainan, 179 to 122 BC, sometime before 139 BC, he risked poisoning himself by trying hundreds of plants so as to distinguish what is edible from what is poisonous. The broken sky that Nuwa had to repair resulted from a war between Yan Di's descendant, the god of fire Zhu Rong, and the god of water Gong Gong. Footnote, again, in the Chinese mythologies there are various accounts which differ as to whether Shennong or Nuwa came first and whether Zhu Rong is the descendant of Shennong or Huang Di. Here, we relate the most well-known version. End of footnote. Note that the gods of agriculture and fire came from different systems of mythology and that although they are called gods, they are only recognized as such after their deaths. Originally, they were leaders of the ancient tribes. Unlike Greek mythology, then, in which the Titan revolted against the gods by bestowing fire and means of subsistence upon human beings, thus raising them above animals, in Chinese mythology there was no such rebellion and no such transcendence granted. This endowment is seen instead of as owing to the benevolence of the ancient sages. In a dialogue with Vernant, French sinologist Jacques Gernet remarked that the radical separation between the world of the gods and the world of man that was necessary for the development of Greek rationality didn't happen in China. Footnote, Vernant, Myth and Society, page 86, end of footnote. Thought of the Greek type did eventually arrive in China, but it arrived too late to exercise any formative influence. The Chinese had already naturalized the divine. Footnote, Gernet also commented elsewhere on the difference between God in Judaism and Christianity and the heaven in Chinese culture. The former, Jewish and Christian, is the God of pastors. He speaks commands, while the Chinese heaven does not speak. It contents itself to produce the seasons and to act continuously by way of its seasonal influxes. End of footnote. In response, Vernant also pointed out that the polar terms characteristic of Greek culture, man, gods, invisible, visible, eternal, mortal, permanent, changing, powerful, powerless, pure, mixed, certain, uncertain, were absent in China, and suggested that this might partially explain why it was the Greeks who invented tragedy. I do not mean simply to gesture towards the obvious fact that there are different mythologies concerning creation and techniques in China, Japan, India, or elsewhere. The point, rather, is that each of these mythologies gives a different origin for techniques, corresponding in each case to different relations between the gods, techniques, humans, and the cosmos. Apart from some efforts in anthropology to discuss the variation of practices across cultures, these relations have been ignored or their impact has not been taken into account in the discourse on techniques and technologies. I propose that it is only by tracing different accounts of the genesis of technicity. Footnote, technicity is a term I borrow from Gilbert Simondon, according to whom technological development should be understood as a lineage of constant bifurcation that begins during the magical phase of human societies, end of footnote, that we can understand what we mean when we speak of different forms of life, and thus different relations to techniques. The effort to relativize the concept of techniques challenges existing anthropological approaches as well as historical studies, which rest on the comparison of the advancement of either individual technical objects or technical systems, in the sense of Bertrand Gilly, in different periods among different cultures. Footnote, French historian of technology Bertrand Gilly, 1920 to 1980, proposed to analyze the history of technology according to what he calls technical systems. Gilly defines a technical system as follows. All techniques are to diverse degrees dependent on one another, and there needs to be a certain coherence between them. This ensemble of the different levels of coherence of all the structures, of all the ensembles, and of all the procedures composes what one can call a technical system. Technical systems underwent mutation in the face of technological revolutions. For example, during the medieval period, 12th and 13th centuries, the Renaissance, 15th century, and the Industrial Revolution, 18th century. The researchers Yao Da-zhi and Per Huglesius accused Gilly's analysis of being Western-centric in the sense that Gilly used European technical systems as his primary references, and in doing so ignored Joseph Needham's observation that Chinese technologies seem to have been more advanced than Europe about 2,000 years ago. For the debate, see Yao Da-zhi and P. Huglesius, Transforming the Narrative of the History of Chinese Technology, East and West, in Bertrand Gilly's History of Techniques. End of footnote. Scientific and technical thinking emerges under cosmological conditions that are expressed in the relations between humans and their milieus, which are never static. For this reason, I would like to call this conception of technics cosmotechnics. One of the most characteristic examples of Chinese cosmotechnics, for example, is Chinese medicine, which uses the same principles and terms found in cosmology, such as yin-yang, wu-xing, harmony, and so on to describe the body. Cosmos, cosmology, and cosmotechnics. Here, one may ask whether Leroy Gorhan's analysis concerning technical facts is not already sufficient to explain different technicities. It is true that Leroy Gorhan brilliantly documented technical tendencies and the diversification of technical facts in his work, documenting different lineages of technical evolution and the influences of the milieu on the fabrication of tools and products. Yet, Leroy Gorhan's research has a limit, even if this also constitutes the strength and singularity of his research, one that seems to stem from his focus upon the individualization of technical objects, so as to construct a technical genealogy and a technical hierarchy applicable across different cultures. From this perspective, we can understand why he would have deliberately limited himself to an explanation of technical genesis based on the study of the development of tools. As he lamented in the postscript to L'Homme et la Matière, written 30 years after its original publication, most classic ethnographies dedicate their first chapter to technics only to turn immediately to social and religious aspects for the remainder. In Leroy Gorhan's work, technics becomes autonomous in the sense that it acts as a lens through which the evolution of the human civilization and culture can be retrieved. However, it is difficult to attribute the singularity of technical facts to the milieu alone, and I do not believe it is possible to avoid the question of cosmology, and therefore that of cosmotechnics. Allow me to pose this question in the form of a Kantian antinomy. 1. Technics is anthropologically universal, and since it consists in the extension of somatic functions and the externalization of memory, the differences produced in different cultures can be explained according to the degree to which factual circumstances inflect the technical tendency. 2. Technics is not anthropologically universal. Technologies in different cultures are affected by the cosmological understanding of these cultures, and have autonomy only within a certain cosmological setting. Technics is always cosmotechnics. The search for a resolution of this antinomy will be the Ariadne's thread of our inquiry. I will give a preliminary definition of cosmotechnics here. It means the unification between the cosmic order and the moral order through technical activities, although the term cosmic order is itself tautological, since the Greek word cosmos means order. The concept of cosmotechnics immediately provides us with a conceptual tool with which to overcome the conventional opposition between technics and nature, and to understand the task of philosophy as that of seeking and affirming the organic unity of the two. In the remainder of this introduction, I will investigate this concept in the work of the 20th century philosopher Gilbert Simondon and that of some contemporary anthropologists, notably Tim Ingold. In the third part of On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, 1958, Simondon sets out a speculative history of technicity, affirming that it is not sufficient just to investigate the technical lineage of objects. It is also necessary to understand that it implies an organic character of thinking and of the mode of being in the world. According to Simondon, the genesis of technicity begins with a magical phase in which we find an original unity anterior to the subject-object division. This phase is characterized by the separation and cohesion between ground and figure. Simondon took these terms from Gestalt psychology, where the figure cannot be detached from ground, and it is the ground that gives form, while at the same time form also imposing limitations on the ground. We can conceive the technicity of the magical phrase as a field of forces reticulated according to what he calls key points, for example, high points such as mountains, giant rocks, or old trees. The primitive magical moment, the original mode of cosmotechnics, is bifurcated into technics and religion, in which the latter retain an equilibrium with the former in the continued effort to obtain unity. Technics and religion yield both theoretical and practical parts. In religion, they are known as ethics, theoretical, and dogma, practical. In technics, science and technology. The magical phase is a mode in which there is hardly any distinction between cosmology and cosmotechnics, since cosmology only makes sense here, when it is part of everyday practice. There is a separation only during the modern period, since the study of technology and the study of cosmology, as astronomy, are regarded as two different disciplines, an indication of the total detachment of technics from cosmology and the disappearance of any overt conception of a cosmotechnics. And yet it would not be correct to say that there is no cosmotechnics in our time. There certainly is. It is what Philippe Descola calls naturalism, meaning the antithesis between culture and nature, which triumphed in the West in the 17th century. Footnote: P. Descola, Beyond Nature and Culture, translator J. Lloyd, Chicago and London, Chicago University Press, 2013, page 85. End of footnote. In this cosmotechnics, the cosmos is seen as an exploitable standing reserve, according to what Heidegger calls the world picture. Here, we should state that for Simondon there remains some possibility of reinventing cosmotechnics, although he doesn't use the term, for our time. In an interview on mechanology, Simondon talks about the TV antenna, beautifully describing what this convergence between modern technology and natural geography should look like. Even though, as far as I am aware, Simondon did not engage further with this subject, it will be our task to take what he meant to say further. Quote, "Look at this TV antenna of television as it is. It is rigid, but it is oriented. We see that it looks into the distance and that it can receive signals from a transmitter far away. For me, it appears to be more than a symbol. It seems to represent a gesture of sorts, an almost magical power of intentionality, a contemporary form of magic. In this encounter between the highest place and the nodal point, which is the point of transmission of hyperfrequencies, there is a sort of co-naturality between the human network and the natural geography of the region. It has a poetic dimension, as well as a dimension having to do with signification and the encounter between significations." End quote. Retrospectively, we may find that Simondon's proposition is incompatible with the distinction between magic and science made by Levi-Strauss in The Savage Mind, published a few years later, 1962. Magic, or rather the science of the concrete, according to Levi-Strauss, cannot be reduced to a stage or phase of technical and scientific evolution. Footnote: See Levi-Strauss, The Savage Mind, London, Weidenfeld and Nicholson, 1966, page 13, end of footnote. Whereas for Simondon, as we have seen, the magical phase occupies the first stage of the genesis of technicity. The science of the concrete, according to Levi-Strauss, is event-driven and sign-oriented, while science is structure-driven and concept-oriented. Thus, for Levi-Strauss, there is a discontinuity between the two, but it seems that the discontinuity is only legitimated when one compares a non-European mythical thought with European scientific thought. In Simondon, on the other hand, the magical retains a continuity with the development of science and technology. I would suggest that what Simondon hints at in the third part of On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects is precisely a cosmotechnics. Once we accept the concept of cosmotechnics instead of maintaining an opposition between the magical/mythical and science and a progression between the two, we will be able to see that the former, characterized as the speculative organization and exploitation of the sensible world in sensible terms, is not necessarily a regression in relation to the latter. Some recent work has suggested that close consideration of non-Western cultures, since it demonstrates a pluralism of ontologies and cosmologies, indicates a way out of the modern predicament. Anthropologists such as Philippe Descola and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro look to Amazonian cultures in order to deconstruct the nature-culture division in Europe. Similarly, philosophers such as François Julian and Augustin Burke attempt to compare European culture with Chinese and Japanese culture so as to depict a profound pluralism that cannot be easily classified according to simple schemes, and to reinterpret Western attempts to overcome modernity. In his seminal work, Beyond Nature and Culture, Descola not only suggests that the nature-culture division developed in the Occident is not universal, but also maintains that it is a marginal case. Descola describes 4 ontologies, namely naturalism, the nature-culture division, animism, totemism, and analogism. Each of these ontologies inscribes nature in different ways, and in non-modern practices one finds that the nature-culture division that has been taken for granted since European modernity does not hold. Footnote, see Descola, Beyond Nature and Culture, especially Part 3, end of footnote. Descola cites social anthropologist Tim Eingold's observation that philosophers have seldom asked, what makes humans animals of a particular kind? Their typical preferred question about naturalism being, what makes humans different in kind from animals? This is not only the case among philosophers, as Descola points out, for ethnologists also fall into the dogma of naturalism, which insists on the uniqueness of the human being and the assumption that humans are differentiated from other beings by means of culture. In a naturalism, one finds discontinuity in interiority and continuity in physicality. In animism, continuity in interiority and discontinuity in physicality. We reproduce Descola's definitions of the 4 ontologies below. Similar interiority, dissimilar physicality. Animism. Similar interiority, similar physicality. Totemism. Dissimilar interiority, similar physicality. Naturalism. Dissimilar interiority, dissimilar physicality. Analogism. These various ontologies imply different conceptions of nature in different forms of participation, and indeed, as Descola pointed out, the antithesis between nature and culture in naturalism is rejected in other conceptions of nature. What Descola says about nature might also be said of technics, which in Descola's writings is abstracted as practice, a term that avoids the technics-culture division. However, calling it practice may obscure the role of technics. This is the reason we speak of cosmotechnics rather than cosmology. Although he does not employ a term analogous to cosmotechnics, Ingold perceives this point clearly. Drawing on Gregory Bateson, Ingold proposes that there is a unity between practices and the environment to which they belong. This leads to his proposal for a sentient ecology. Footnote, T. Ingold, The Perception of the Environment, Essays on Livelihood, Dwelling, and Skill. London, Routledge, 2011, page 24. End of footnote, which is mediated and operated according to effective relations between human beings and their environments. One example he gives concerning hunter-gatherer society helps to clarify what he means by sentient ecology. Hunter-gatherers' perception of the environment, he tells us, is embedded in their practices. Ingold points out that the Cree people of northeastern Canada have an explanation for why reindeers are easy to kill. The animals offer themselves voluntarily in a spirit of goodwill or even love towards the hunter. The encounter between animal and hunter is not simply a question of to shoot or not to shoot, but rather of one cosmological and moral necessity. Quote, at that crucial moment of eye-to-eye contact, the hunter felt the overwhelming presence of the animal. He felt as if his own being were somehow bound up or intermingled with that of the animal, a feeling tantamount to love, and one that, in the domain of human relations, is experienced in sexual intercourse. End quote. Rethinking senses, such as vision, hearing, and touch by invoking Hans Jonas, James Gibson, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Ingold attempts to show that, when we reinvestigate the question of the senses, it is possible to reappropriate this sentient ecology, which is totally ignored in modern technological development, and yet in this conception of human and environment, the relation between environment and cosmology is not very clear. And this way of analyzing living beings with the environment risks reduction to a cybernetic feedback model, such as Bateson's, thereby undermining the absolutely overwhelming and contingent role of the cosmos. Simondon holds a similar view on the relation between human being and the outer world as figure and ground, a functioning model of cosmotechnics, since the ground is limited by the figure, and the figure is empowered by the ground. Owing to their detachment in religion, the ground is no longer limited by the figure, and therefore the unlimited ground is conceived as a godlike power, whereas inversely, in technics, the figure overtakes the ground and leads to the subversion of their relation. Simondon therefore proposes a task for philosophical thinking to produce a convergence that reaffirms the unity of figure and ground, something that could be understood as the search for a cosmotechnics. For example, in considering Polynesian navigation, the ability to navigate among 1,000 islands without any modern apparatus, as a cosmotechnics, we might focus not on this ability as a skill, but rather on the figure-ground relation that prefigures this skill. The comparison between the work of Ingold and other ethnologists and Simondon indicates two different ways in which the question concerning technology in China might be approached. In the first, we are given a way in which to comprehend cosmology, which conditions social and political life, while in the second, philosophical thought is reconfigured as a search for the ground of the figure, whose relation seems to be more and more distanced due to the increasing specialization and division of professions in modern societies. The cosmotechnics of ancient China and the philosophical thought developed throughout its history seem to me to reflect a constant effort to bring about precisely such a unification of ground and figure. In Chinese cosmology, one finds a sense other than vision, hearing, and touch. It is called gan ying, literally meaning feeling and response, and is often, as in the work of sinologists such as Marcel Granet and Angus Graham, understood as correlative thinking. Footnote, A.C. Graham, Yin Yang and the Nature of Correlative Thinking, Singapore, National University of Singapore, 1986. End of footnote. I prefer to call it resonance, following Joseph Needham. It yields a moral sentiment and further a moral obligation in social and political terms, which is not solely the product of subjective contemplation, but rather emerges from the resonance between the heaven and the human, since the heaven is the ground of the moral. Footnote, concerning the origin of the moral order, it is difficult, for instance, to find an explanation in Henry Bergson's The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, translators A. Audra and C. Barrington, London, Macmillan, 1935. Bergson distinguishes two kinds of morals. One is a closed morals related to social obligation and habitude, while the other is what he calls an open morals related to the call of the hero. In the latter form, one doesn't yield to pressure, but to fascination. According to Bergson, these two forms of the moral coexist, and neither exists in pure form. It would certainly be worthwhile to further examine Bergson's concept of the moral and its implications for the Chinese cosmotechnics that I attempt to sketch out here, although it seems to me that Bergson's understanding of the moral is rather limited to the Western tradition, especially the Greeks. In China, the cosmos played a determining role, so that any heroic act could only be in accordance with the heavens. End of footnote. The existence of such a resonance rests upon the presupposition of unification between the human and the heaven, and therefore gan ying implies 1. A homogeneity in all beings, and 2. An organicity of the relation between part, and between part and whole. Footnote, Huang Junjie, New Perspectives on the History of Confucianism in East Asia, Taiwan, Taiwan National University Press, 2015, page 267. End of footnote. This homogeneity can be found already in Zhou Yi Shi Zi. Footnote. According to historical documents, there were 3 versions of the I Ching, or the Book of Changes, in China, but only one, Zhou Yi, has been preserved and circulated. There are 7 classic commentaries on the I Ching, known as Yizhuan, each including the Shi Zi quoted below. Together, these 10 texts, including the lost ones, are known as the 10 Wings. End of footnote. Where the ancient Bao Shi, another name for Fu Shi, created the 8 trigrams to reflect the connection of all beings through these homogeneities. Quote, anciently, when Bao Shi had come to the rule of all under heaven, looking up, he contemplated the brilliant forms exhibited in the sky, and looking down he surveyed the patterns shown on the earth. He contemplated the ornamental appearances of birds and beasts and the different suitabilities of the soil. Near at hand in his own person he found things for consideration, and the same at a distance, in things in general. On this he devised the 8 trigrams to show fully the attributes of the spirit-like and intelligent operations working secretly, and to classify the qualities of the myriad of things. End quote. Words such as forms, patterns, and appearances are essential in understanding the resonances between the heaven and the human. They imply an attitude towards science in China, which, according to the organismic readings offered by authors such as Joseph Needham, differs from that of Greece, since it is resonance that lends authority to rules and laws, whereas for the Greeks, laws are closely related to geometry, as Vernant frequently points out. But how is this resonance to be sensed? Confucianism and Taoism both postulate a cosmological heart or mind, able to resonate with the external environment, for example, in Luxuriant Dew of the Spring and Autumn Annals. Footnote, authorship of this work is attributed to the important Han Confucian Dong Zhongshu, 179 to 104 BC, who we will discuss below. End of footnote. As well as with other beings, for example in Mencius. We will see later how it is this sense that leads to the development of a moral cosmology or moral metaphysics in China, which is expressed in the unification between the heaven and the human. Importantly, for our argument here, in the context of techniques such as unification, is also expressed as the unification of qi, literally translated as tools, and Tao, often translated as Tao. For example, in Confucianism, qi implies a cosmological consciousness of the relations between humans and nature that is demonstrated in rituals and religious ceremonies. As we discuss in Part 1, the Confucian classics Li Ji, the Book of Rituals, contains a long section entitled Li Qi, the Vessels of Rituals, documenting the importance of technical objects in the fulfillment of the Li rituals, and according to which morality can only be maintained through the proper use of Li Qi. It will be the task of Part 1 to elaborate on this correlative thinking in China and on the dynamic relation between Qi and Tao. I believe that the concept of cosmotechnics allows us to trace different technicities and contributes to opening up the plurality of relations between technics, mythology, and cosmology, and thereby to the embracing of the different relations between the human and technics inherited from different mythologies and cosmologies. Certainly, Prometheanism is one such relation, but it is highly problematic to take it as a universal. However, I am certainly not proposing to advocate any kind of cultural purity here, or to defend it as origin against contamination. Technics has served as a means of communication between different ethnic groups, which immediately calls into question any concept of an absolute origin. In our technological epoch, it is the driving force of globalization, in the sense both of a converging force acting through space and a synchronizing force in time. Yet a radical alterity will have to be asserted in order to leave room for heterogeneity and thereby to develop different epistemes based on traditional metaphysical categories, a task which opens the way to the veritable question of locality. I use the term episteme with reference to Michel Foucault, for whom it denotes a social and scientific structure that functions as a set of criteria of selection and determines the discourse of truth. Footnote, M. Foucault, The Order of Things in Archaeology of the Human Sciences, New York Vintage Books, 1994. Quote, what I am attempting to bring to light is the epistemological field, the epistememe, in which knowledge, envisaged apart from all criteria, having reference to its rational value or to its objective forms, grounds its positivity and thereby manifests a history which is not that of its growing perfection, but rather that of its conditions of possibility. In this account, what should appear are those configurations within the space of knowledge which have given rise to the diverse forms of empirical science. End quote. End of footnote. In The Order of Things, Foucault introduces a periodization of three epistemes in the Occident: Renaissance, Classical, and Modern. Foucault later found that his introduction of the term episteme had led to an impasse and developed a more general concept, namely that of the dispositif. The transition from episteme to dispositif is a strategic move to a more imminent critique which Foucault was able to apply in a more contemporary analysis. Looking back, during an interview in 1977, around the time of the publication of The History of Sexuality, Foucault proposed to define episteme as a form of dispositif, as that strategic dispositif which allows the selection among all possible enunciations of those that will be acceptable within a field of scientificity of which one can say, this is true or false. I take the liberty of reformulating the concept of episteme here, for it is a dispositif which, in the face of modern technology, may be reinvented on the basis of the traditional metaphysical categories in order to reintroduce a form of life and to reactivate a locality. Such reinventions can be observed, for example, following the social, political, and economic crises that occurred in each epoch in China, and we can surely find examples in other cultures. The decline of the Zhou dynasty, 1122 to 256 BC, the introduction of Buddhism in China, the country's defeat in the Opium Wars, etc. At these points we observe the reinvention of an episteme, which, in turn, conditions aesthetic, social, and political life. The technical systems that are in the process of forming today, fueled by digital technologies, for example, smart cities, the Internet of Things, social networks, and large-scale automation systems, tend to lead to a homogeneous relation between humanity and technics, that of intensive quantification and control. But this only makes it more important and more urgent for different cultures to reflect on their own history and ontologies in order to adopt digital technologies without being merely synchronized into the homogeneous global and generic episteme. The decisive moment in modern Chinese history came with the two Opium Wars in the mid-19th century, in which the Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1912, was comprehensively defeated by the British Army, leading to the opening up of China as a quasi-colony for Western forces and instigating China's modernization. Lack of technological competence was considered by the Chinese to be one of the major reasons for this defeat. They therefore felt with urgency the need for rapidly modernization via technological development in the hopes of putting an end to the inequality between China and the Western forces. However, China was not able to absorb Western technology in the way that the dominant Chinese reformists at that time wished, largely due to the ignorance and misunderstanding of technology, for they maintained a belief which, retrospectively, seems rather Cartesian, that it would be possible to separate Chinese thought, the mind, from technologies understood merely as instruments, that the former, the ground, could remain intact without being affected by the importation and implementation of the technological figure. On the contrary, technology has ended up subverting any such dualism and has constituted itself as ground rather than as figure. More than a century and a half has passed since the Opium Wars. China has lived through further catastrophes and crises owing to the change of regimes and all manner of experimental reforms. During this time, there have been many reflections on the question of technology and modernization, and the attempt to maintain a dualism between thinking mind and technological instrument has been revealed as a failure. More seriously, in recent decades, any such reflection has been rendered impotent in the face of continuing economic and technological booms. A kind of ecstasy and hype has emerged in its stead, propelling the country into the unknown. All of a sudden, it finds itself as if in the midst of an ocean without being able to see any limit, any destination. The predicament described by Nietzsche in The Gay Science, and which remains a poignant image for describing modern man's troubling situation. Footnote, Friedrich Nietzsche, The Gay Science, translator J. Knockoff. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 2001, page 119. End of footnote. In Europe, various concepts, such as the postmodern or posthuman, have been invented to name some imaginary exodus from this situation. but it will not be possible to find the exit without directly addressing and confronting the question of technology. With all of the above questions in mind, this work aims to open up a new inquiry into modern technology, one that does not take Prometheanism as its fundamental presupposition. The work is divided into 2 parts. Part 1 is intended to be a systematic and historical survey of technological thought in China in comparison to its counterpart in Europe. It serves as a new starting point for understanding what is at stake here, as well as for reflecting on the urgency of this investigation. Part 2 is an investigation into the historical-metaphysical questions of modern technology and aims to shed new light on the obscurity in which the question of technology dwells in China, especially in the Anthropocene. Technological rupture and metaphysical unity. As implied by the concept of cosmotechnics outlined above, the account of technology given here does not limit itself to the historical, social, and economic levels. We have to move beyond these levels in order to reconstitute a metaphysical unity. By unity, I do not mean a political or cultural identity, but a unity between practice and theory, or more precisely, a form of life that maintains the coherence, if not necessarily the harmony, of a community. The fragmentation of forms of life in both European and non-European countries is largely a result of an inconsistency between theory and practice. But in the East, this gap is revealed not as a mere disturbance, but as the deracination described by Heidegger as a total discontinuity. The transformation of practices brought about by modern technology outstrips the ancient categories that had previously applied. For example, as I discuss in Part 1, the Chinese have no equivalents of the categories that the Greeks called techni and physis. Hence, in China, the force of technology dismantles the metaphysical unity of practice and theory and creates a rupture, which still awaits unification. Of course, this is not something that is only happening in the East. In the West, as Heidegger described, the emergence of the category technology no longer shares the same essence as techni. The question concerning technology should ultimately serve as a motivation to take up the question of being, and, if I might say so, to create a new metaphysics, or even better, a new cosmotechnics. Footnote: although Heidegger did not explicitly make this claim in his commentary on Nietzsche, he refers to metaphysics as a force of unification that overlooks all beings. However, we have to bear in mind that Heidegger's reading of the history of Western metaphysics is only one possible interpretation. See M. Heidegger, GA 6.2, Nietzsche, Band 2, 1997, page 342 to 343. End of footnote. In our time, this unification or indifference does not present itself as a quest for a ground, but rather exhibits itself as both an original ground, Urgrund, and an unground, Ungrund. Ungrund because it is open to alterities, Urgrund as a ground that resists assimilation. Hence the Urgrund and the Ungrund should be considered as a unity, much like being and nothingness. The quest for unity is, properly speaking, the telos of philosophy, as Hegel maintained in his treatise on Schelling and Fichte. Footnote: G.W.F. Hegel, The Difference Between Fichte and Schelling's System. End of footnote. As we shall see, to answer the question concerning technology in China is not to give a detailed history of the economic and social development of technologies, something that historians and sinologists, such as Joseph Needham, have already done in various brilliant ways, but rather to describe the transformation of the category qi and in its relation to Tao. Let me be more precise on this point. Normally, technics and technology are translated in Chinese as ji shu and ke ji. The first term means technique or skill. The second is composed of 2 characters, ke meaning science, ke shui, and ji meaning technique or applied science. The question is not whether these translations adequately render the meanings of the Western words. One has to note that the translations are newly coined terms, but rather whether they create the illusion that Western techniques have an equivalent in the Chinese tradition. Ultimately, the eagerness these Chinese neologisms express to show that we also have these terms obscures the true question of technics, rather than relying on these potentially confusing neologisms. Therefore, I propose to reconstruct the question of technics from the ancient philosophical categories Qi and Dao, tracing various turning points at which the two were separated, reunified, or even totally disregarded. The relation between Qi and Dao characterizes, properly speaking, the thinking of technics in China, which is also a unification of moral and cosmological thinking in a cosmotechnics. It is in associating Qi and Dao that the question of technics reaches its metaphysical ground. It is also in entering into this relation that Qi participates in moral cosmology and intervenes in the metaphysical system according to its own evolution. Thus, we will show how the relation between Qi and Dao has varied throughout the history of Chinese thought, following continual attempts to reunify Dao and Qi, each with different nuances and different consequences. Qi enlightens Dao, Qi carries Dao, or Qi in the service of Dao, Dao in the service of Qi, and so on. Below, we trace these relations from the era of Confucius and Lao Tzu into contemporary China. Finally, we show how the imposition of a superficial and reductive materialism ended up completely separating Qi and Dao, an event that may be considered as the breakdown of the traditional system, and may even be termed China's own end of metaphysics. Although, once again, here we should emphasize that what is called metaphysics in the European language is not equivalent to its usual translation in Chinese, 形而上学, which actually means that which is above forms, and is a synonym of Tao in the I Ching. What Heidegger terms the end of metaphysics, then, is by no means the end of 形而上学, because for Heidegger, it is the completion of metaphysics that gives us modern techno-science, whereas 形而上学 cannot give rise to modern technology, since, firstly, it doesn't have the same source as the metaphysica, and secondly, as we will explain in detail below, if we follow new Confucian philosopher Mou Zongsan, Chinese thought has always given priority to the noumenon over the phenomenon, and it is precisely because of this philosophical attitude that a different cosmotechnics developed in China. It is not my aim, however, to argue that the traditional Chinese metaphysics is sufficient and that we can simply go back to it. On the contrary, I would like to show that while it is insufficient to simply revive the traditional metaphysics, it is crucial that we start from it in order to seek ways other than affirmative Prometheanism or neocolonial critique to think and to challenge global technical hegemony. The ultimate task will be to reinvent the Tao-Qi relation by situating it historically and asking in what way this line of thinking might be fruitful, not only in the construction of a new Chinese philosophy of technology, but also in responding to the current state of technological globalization. Inevitably, this task will also have to respond to the haunting dilemma of what is called Needham's question. Why didn't modern science and technology emerge in China? In the 16th century, Europeans were attracted by China, by its aesthetics and its culture, but also by its advanced technologies. For example, Leibniz was obsessed with Chinese writing, especially by his discovery that the I Ching is organized according to precisely the binary system he himself had proposed. He thus believed he had discovered in the Chinese writings an advanced mode of combinatorics. After the 16th century, though, science and technology in China were outstripped by the West. According to the dominant view, it is the modernization of science and technology in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries that accounts for this change. Such an explanation is accidental in the sense that it relies on a rupture or an event, but as we shall try to elaborate, there may be another explanation from the standpoint of metaphysics. In asking why modern science and technology did not emerge in China, we will discuss the tentative answers given both by Needham himself and by Chinese philosophers Feng Youlan and Mou Zongsan. Mou's answer is the most sophisticated and speculative of the two, and the solution he proposes demands a reunification of two metaphysical systems, one that speculates on the nominal world and makes it the core constituent of a moral metaphysics. and another that tends to limit itself to the level of phenomena, and in doing so furnishes the terrain for highly analytical activities. This reading is clearly influenced by Kant, and indeed Mou frequently employs Kant's vocabulary. Mou recalls that when he first read Kant, he was struck by the fact that what Kant calls the noumenon is at the core of Chinese philosophy, and that it is the respective focus on noumenon and phenomenon that marks the difference between Chinese and European metaphysics. Footnote, Mou Zongsan, Collected Works, Volume 21. End of footnote. Indulging in speculation on the noumenon, Chinese philosophy tends to advance the activities of intellectual intuition but refrains from dealing with the phenomenal world. It pays attention to the latter only in order to take it as a stepping stone to reach above form. Mou therefore argues that in order to revive traditional Chinese thought, an interface has to be reconstructed between nominal ontology and phenomenal ontology. This connection cannot come from anywhere other than the Chinese tradition itself, since ultimately Mou means it to be a proof that traditional Chinese thought can also develop modern science and technology, and only needs a new method in order to do so. This sums up the task of the new Confucianism. Footnote, it is necessary to distinguish Neo-Confucianism, a metaphysical movement that culminated during the Song and Ming dynasties, from New Confucianism, which is a movement that started in the early 20th century. End of footnote, which developed in Taiwan and Hong Kong after the Second World War, and which we discuss in Part 1. However, Mou's proposal remains an idealist one because he considers Xin, or the nominal subject, as the ultimate possibility. According to him, though, through self-negation it can descend so as to become a subject of phenomenal knowledge. Footnote, Mou himself claims that he is not an idealist, since Xin is not the mind, it is more than the mind and offers more possibilities. End of footnote. Part 2 of the book serves as a critique of Mou's approach and proposes to go back to the technical objects themselves as an alternative, or better, a supplement, to this idealist vision. Modernity, modernization, and technicity. In attempting to think through Mou's proposition of an interface between Chinese and Western thought while avoiding his idealism, Part 2 finds that what is central here is the relation between technics and time. Here I turn to Bernard Stiegler's reformulation of the history of Western philosophy according to the question of technicity in Technics and Time. But time has never been a real question for Chinese philosophy, as sinologists Marcel Granet and François Julien have stated clearly. The Chinese never really elaborated on the question of time. This, therefore, opens up the possibility in the wake of Stiegler's work of an investigation into the relation between technics and time in China. Based on the work of Leroy-Gourhan, Husserl, and Heidegger, Stiegler attempts to put an end to a modernity characterized by technological unconsciousness. Technological unconsciousness is the consciousness of time, of one's finitude, but also of the relation between this finitude and technicity. Stiegler convincingly shows how, from Plato on, the relation between technics and anamnesis is already well established and stands at the center of the economy of the soul. After reincarnation, the soul forgets the knowledge of truth that it has acquired in the past life, and the search for truth is fundamentally an act of remembering or recollection. Socrates famously demonstrates this in the Meno. Where the young slave, with the aid of technical tools, drawing in the sand, is able to solve geometrical problems of which he has no prior knowledge at all. The economy of the soul in the East, though, has little in common with such an animistic conception of time. We must say that even though the calendrical devices of the cultures resemble each other, in these technical objects we find not only different technical lineages but also different interpretations of time, which configure the function and perception of these technical objects in everyday life. This is largely the result of the influence of Taoism and Buddhism, which combined with Confucianism to produce what Mou Zongsan calls the synthetic approach to comprehending reason, in contrast to Occidental culture's analytic approach to comprehending reason. In the nominal experience implied by the former, there is simply no time, or more precisely, time and historicity do not occur as questions. In Heidegger, historicity is the hermeneutics conditioned by the finitude of Dasein and technics, which infinitizes Dasein's retentional finitude by passing exteriorized memory from generation to generation. Mou appreciated Heidegger's critique of Kant in Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, in which Heidegger radicalized the transcendental imagination, making it a question of time. However, Mou also sees Heidegger's analysis of finitude as a limitation, since for Mou, Xin, qua nominal subject, is that which can indeed infinitize. Mou did not formulate any material relation between technics and the Xin, since he largely disregarded the question of technics, which for him is only one of the possibilities of the self-negation of the liangzhi, heart/mind. It is to this lack of reflection on the question of technics, I speculate, that we can attribute the failure of new Confucianism to respond to the problem of modernization and the question of historicity. However, it is possible and necessary to transform this lack into a positive concept, a task akin to that undertaken by Jean-François Lyotard, as we shall examine below. This disregarding of time and lack of any discourse on historicity in Chinese metaphysics was noted by Keiji Nishitani, 1900 to 1990, a Japanese philosopher of the Kyoto school who studied under Heidegger in Freiburg during the 1930s. For Nishitani, Eastern philosophy did not take the concept of time seriously and hence was unable to account for concepts such as historicity, that is, the ability to think as a historical being. This question is indeed a most Heideggerian one. In the second division of Being and Time, the philosopher discussed the relation between individual time and the relation to historicity. But in Nishitani's attempt to think East and West together, two problems arise and present a dilemma. Firstly, for the Japanese philosopher, technology opens a path toward nihility, as do the works of Nietzsche and Heidegger. But in the Buddhism espoused by Nishitani, emptiness aims to transcend nihility, and in such transcendence, time loses all meaning. Footnote, K. Nishitani, Religion and Nothingness, Berkeley, University of California Press, 1982. End of footnote. Secondly, historicity and further world historicity are not possible without a retentional system, which, as Stiegler shows in the third volume of Technics and Time, is also technics. Footnote B. Stiegler, Technics and Time 3, Cinematic Time and the Question of Malaise. Translator S. Barker, Stanford University Press, 2010. End of footnote. This means that it is not possible to be conscious of the relation between Dasein and historicity without being conscious of the relation between Dasein and technicity, that is to say, historical consciousness demands technological consciousness. As I argue in Part 2, modernity functions according to a technological unconsciousness which consists of a forgetting of one's own limits, as described by Nietzsche in The Gay Science. The poor bird that is felt free and now strikes against the walls of this cage. Woe when homesickness for the land overcomes you, as if there had been more freedom there, and there is no more land. Footnote F. Nietzsche, The Gay Science. Translator J. Knockoff, Cambridge University Press, 2001, page 119. End of footnote. This predicament arises precisely from a lack of awareness of the instruments at hand, their limits, and their dangers. Modernity ends with the rise of a technological consciousness, meaning both the consciousness of the power of technology and the consciousness of the technological condition of the human. In order to tackle the questions raised by Nishitani and Mou Zongsan, it is necessary to articulate the question of time and history with that of technics, so as to open up a new terrain and to explore a thinking that bridges nominal ontology and phenomenal ontology. But in demanding that a Chinese philosophy of technology adopt this post-Heideggerian, Stieglerian viewpoint, aren't we in danger of simply imposing a Western point of view once again? Not necessarily, since what is more fundamental today is to seek a new conception of world history and a cosmotechnical thinking that will give us a new way of being with technical objects and systems. Far from simply renouncing the analyses of Mou and Nishitani and replacing it with Stiegler's, we therefore pose the following question. Rather than absorbing technics into either of their ontologies, is it possible to understand technics as a medium for the two ontologies? For Nishitani, the question was, can absolute nothingness appropriate modernity and hence construct a new world history that is not limited by Western modernity? For Mou, can Chinese thinking absorb modern science and technology through a reconfiguration of its own thinking that already lies within the possibilities of the latter? Nishitani's answer leads to a proposal for a total war as a strategy to overcome modernity, something that was taken up as the slogan of the Kyoto School philosophers prior to the Second World War. This is what I term a metaphysical fascism, which arises from a misdiagnosis of the question of modernity and is something we must avoid at all costs. Mou's answer was affirmative and positive, even if, as we will see in part 1, it was widely questioned by Chinese intellectuals. It seems to me that both Mou and Nishitani, as well as their schools and the epochs in which they lived, failed to overcome modernity largely because they didn't take the question of technology seriously enough. However, we still have to pass through their work in order to clarify these problems. One point that can be stated clearly here is that in order to heal the rupture of the metaphysical system introduced by modern technology, we cannot rely on any speculative idealist thinking. Instead, it is necessary to take the materiality of technics, as ergon, into account. This is not a materialism in the classical sense, but one that pushes the possibility of matter to its limits. This question is at once speculative and political. In 1986, Jean-François Lyotard, on the invitation of Bernard Stiegler, gave a seminar at IRCAM at the Centre Pompidou in Paris. Later published under the title Logos and Technique, or Telegraphy. In the seminar, Lyotard asked whether it is possible that, rather than being retentional devices, the new technologies might open up a new possibility of thinking, what the 13th century Japanese Zen Buddhist Dojin calls the clear mirror. Lyotard's question resonates with the analysis of Mou and Nishitani, since the clear mirror fundamentally constitutes the heart of the metaphysical systems of the East. Towards the end of the talk, Lyotard concludes as follows, quote, "The whole question is this: is the passage possible? Will it be possible with, or allowed by, the new mode of inscription and memorization that characterizes the new technologies? Do they not impose syntheses, and syntheses conceived still more intimately in the soul than any earlier technology has done? But by that very fact, do they not also help to refine our anamnesiac resistance?" I'll stop on this vague hope, which is too dialectical to take seriously. All this remains to be thought out and tried out. End quote. Why did Lyotard, having made this proposal, retreat from it, suggesting that it was too vague and too dialectical to be taken seriously? Lyotard approached the question from the opposite direction to Mou Zongsan and Keiji Nishitani. He was looking for a passage from west to east. However, Lyotard's limited knowledge of the East did not allow him to go further into the question of world historicity. Along with many others of his time, notably Bruno Latour, Lyotard is a representative of the second attempt of European intellectuals to overcome modernity. The first attempt was around the time of the First World War, when intellectuals were conscious of the decline of the West and the crisis that was presenting itself in the domains of culture: Oswald Spengler; science, Edmund Husserl; mathematics, Hermann Weyl; physics, Albert Einstein; and mechanics, Richard von Mises. In parallel, East Asia saw the first generation of new Confucians: Xiangshi Li, the teacher of Mou Zongsan and Liang Shuming, and intellectuals such as Liang Qi Chao and Zhang Junmai. The very much Germanized Kyoto School, and then the second generation of new Confucians in the 1970s, all of whom attempted to broach the same questions. However, Like the first generation of new Confucians, they remained insensitive to their idealist approach towards modernization and didn't give the question of technology the properly philosophical status that it deserves. In Europe, we are now witnessing a third attempt with anthropologists such as de Scola and Lyotard, who seek to use the event of the Anthropocene as an opportunity to overcome modernity in order to open up an ontological pluralism. In parallel, in Asia, we also see the efforts of scholars who are seeking ways to understand modernity without relying on European discourse, notably the Inter-Asia School, initiated by Johnson, Chong, and others. What is the ontological turn for? For Lyotard, the question he poses is also that of possible resistance against the reigning technological hegemony, the product of Occidental metaphysics. This is precisely the task of the postmodern. Beyond its aesthetic expressions, certain other thinkers, such as Lyotard and de Scola, who eschew the postmodern, are instead drawn to the non-modern in order to address this task. However, no matter what we call it, Lyotard's question deserves to be taken up seriously once more, and, as we shall see, this question converges with the inquiries of Nishitani, Mou, Stiegler, and Heidegger. If an anthropology of nature is possible and necessary in order to elaborate on non-modern modes of thinking, then the same operation is possible for technics. It is on this point that we can and must engage with contemporary European thought concerning the program of overcoming modernity, as clearly and symptomatically exemplified, for instance, in the recent work of French philosopher Pierre Montebello, Cosmomorphic Metaphysics, the End of the Human World. Montebello attempts to show how the search for a post-Kantian metaphysics, hand in hand with the ontological turn in contemporary anthropology, can lead us, Europeans at least, out of the trap that modernity has set for us. Kant's metaphysics, as Montebello puts it, is based on limits. Kant already warned readers of the Critique of Pure Reason about the Schwärmerei, or fanaticism of speculative reason, and attempted to draw the boundaries of pure reason. For Kant, the term critique doesn't carry a negative signification, but rather a positive one, namely that of exposing the conditions of the possibility of the subject in question, the limits within which the subject can experience. This setting of limits appears again when we consider Kant's division between phenomenon and noumenon, and his refusal to consider human beings capable of intellectual intuition or intuition of the thing in itself. For Kant, human beings only have sensible intuitions corresponding to phenomenon. Montebello's formulation of the becoming of post-Kantian metaphysics, as exemplified in the thought of Whitehead, Deleuze, Tarde, and Lyotard, hinges on the attempt to overcome such a metaphysics of limits, and therefore proposes a necessary infinitization. The political danger of the Kantian legacy is that human beings become more and more detached from the world, a process formulated by Bruno Lyotard as follows, quote, "Things in themselves become inaccessible while, symmetrically, the transcendental subject becomes infinitely remote from the world." End quote. Mou Zongsan's critique of Kant accords in this respect with Montebello's, though Mou proposes a different way to think about infinitization, namely, through the reinvention of Kantian intellectual intuition in terms drawn from Chinese philosophy. Montebello proposes that the work of Quentin Milesseau stands out as a challenge to the limit of modernity, here a synonym for the Kantian legacy of the metaphysics of limits. One central feature of the latter that Milesseau calls into question is what he calls correlationism, the stipulation that any object of knowledge can only be thought in relation to the conditions according to which it is manifested to a subject. This paradigm, according to Milesseau, has been predominant in Western philosophy for more than 2 centuries, for example in German idealism and phenomenology. Milesseau's question is simply this: how far can reason reach? Can reason accede to a temporality where it itself ceases to be, for example, in thinking objects belonging to an ancestral era prior to the appearance of humanity? Although Montebello acknowledges Milesseau's work, at the same time he strategically portrays Milesseau and Alain Badiou as representatives of a failed attempt to escape finitude that relies on the mathematical infinite. When Montebello says mathematics here, he means numerical reduction, and he jointly condemns both mathematics in this sense and correlationism. Quote, "The monster with two heads simultaneously affirms a world without man, mathematical, glacial, desert, unlivable, and man without world, haunting, spectral, pure spirit. Mathematics and correlation, far from opposing each other, marry each other in funereal weddings." End quote. It is not our task here to examine Montebello's verdict against Badiou and Melisot. What interests us is the solution he proposes, which consists in affirming instead the multiplicity of relations that situate us in the world. We can understand this as a resistance against a thinking based on mathematical rationality, and which takes into consideration the history of cosmology, which we can analyze in terms of the progress of geometry and its departure from myth, and its ultimate completion in astronomy. It seems to me that this type of relational thinking is emerging in Europe as a replacement for a substantialist thinking that has survived since antiquity. This is evident in the so-called ontological turn in anthropology, for example in de Scola's analysis of the ecology of relations, as well as in philosophy, where Whitehead and Simondon's anti-substantialist relational thinking is gaining more and more attention. Here the concept of relation dissolves the concept of substance, which becomes a unity of relations. These relations constantly weave with each other to construct the web of the world as well as our relations with other beings. Such a multiplicity of relations can be found in many non-European cultures, as demonstrated in the works of anthropologists such as de Scola, Viveiros de Castro, Ingold, and others. In these multiplicities of relations, one finds new forms of participation according to different cosmologies, and in this sense Montebello proposes to think about cosmomorphosis rather than anthropomorphosis, to think beyond the anthropos and to reconfigure our practices according to the cosmos. Naturalism, as we have seen above, is only one such cosmology alongside others such as animism, analogism, totemism, and what Viveiros de Castro calls perspectivism, meaning the exchange of perspective between humans and animals, where, for example, the peccary sees itself as hunter and vice versa. Viveiros de Castro uses Deleuze and Guattari's concept of intensity to describe a new form of participation, becoming others, which sheds light on the possibilities of a post-structural anthropology. The importance of Viveiros de Castro's contribution is that he introduces a new way to do anthropology that is not confined to the legacy of Levi-Straussian structuralism. To his eyes, if Western relativism, e.g., the recognition of multiple ontologies, implies a multiculturalism as public politics, then Amerindian perspectivism can give us a multinaturalism as cosmic politics. Unlike naturalism, these other forms of cosmology operate according to continuities, e.g., intensities, becoming, rather than discontinuities between culture and nature. For the same reasons, I propose to investigate technological thinking in China without adopting the structuralist anthropological approach fashioned by sinologists such as A.C. Graham and B.I. Schwartz. Montebello argues that a return to a more profound philosophy of nature is able to overcome the Anthropocene, the symbol of modernity, by bringing back a new way of being together and being with. Such a concept of nature is one that would resist the division between culture and nature found in naturalism. Now, the examples Montebello borrows from de Scola and Viveiros de Castro resonate strongly with the concept of Tao, a cosmological and moral principle which, as I discuss below, is based on the resonance between and the unification of the human and the heaven. The Chinese cosmology, based on this resonance, is ultimately a moral cosmology. It is this cosmological view that defines the interaction between humans and the world in terms of both natural resources and cultural practices, family hierarchy, social and political order, public policies, and human and non-human relations. Indeed, in the work of de Scola, one finds occasional references to Chinese culture which seem to originate in the work of Julian and Grenet. Reading Grenet, for example, de Scola finds that during the European Renaissance, analogism rather than naturalism was the dominant ontology. Naturalism, in this sense, is only a product of modernity. It is fragile, lacking in ancient roots. Yet I am skeptical that this kind of return to or reinvention of the concept of nature, or a return to some archaic cosmology, is sufficient to overcome modernity. This skepticism is both epistemological and political. Montebello mobilizes Simondon to show that nature is the pre-individual and that it is therefore the foundation of all forms of individuation. It is true that Simondon speaks of, quote, this pre-individual reality that the individual carries within it and which could be named nature, thereby rediscovering in the word nature the meaning that the pre-Socratic philosophers gave it. Nature is not the opposite of man, but the first phase of being, the second phase being the opposition of the individual and the milieu, end quote. But what is nature for Simondon? As I have shown elsewhere, the existence of two separate currents of reception of Simondon, as philosopher of nature and as philosopher of technology, based respectively on his two theses, remains problematic, since what Simondon in fact sought to do was to overcome the discontinuities between nature, culture, and technics. What is in question here is not just the interpretation of Simondon, but rather this nature itself, and the tension between nature and the global technological condition will not disappear just because of a narrative of the ontological turn. This observation brings us to the global techno-political dimension that I would like to add to this discourse. It is understandable that a European philosopher might believe that once Europe manages to distance itself from modernity, then other cultures will be able to resume their interrupted cosmologies, and that therefore in opening up European thought to other ontologies, he also saves the other from its subjection to Western technological thinking. But there is a blind spot at work here. When Montebello and others recognize that European naturalism is a rare and perhaps exceptional case, they don't seem to take account of the extent to which this view has pervaded other cultures through modern technology and colonization, those cultures which, over the past century, have had to contend with European colonization, have already undergone great changes and transformations to the extent that the global technical condition has become their own destiny. Given this reversal in perspectives, any return to nature is questionable at best. This book would like to offer another standpoint, using China as an example to describe the other side of modernity and hopefully providing some insights into the current program of overcoming modernity or resetting modernity in the era of digitalization and the Anthropocene. To return to ancient categories and invoke the concept of cosmotechnics is by no means to return to them as truth or as explanation. The scientific knowledge of today confirms that many of the ancient modes of thought are replete with misconceptions, and on this basis a certain scientism may even refuse any consideration of the question of being and the question of Tao alike. However, it should be restated that through the trajectory that this book will outline, I seek to reinvent a cosmotechnics and not just to return to belief in a cosmology. Neither do I seek a return to nature, in the sense that many read Ionian philosophy or Taoist philosophy as a philosophy of nature, but rather to reconcile technics and nature as Simondon proposed in his thesis on the genesis of technicity. Some notes on method. Before embarking upon our inquiry, a few words should be added concerning its method. Although I attempt to outline the historical transformations of the Qi-Dao relation, I am aware that its complexity is far beyond the simple sketch that I can offer here, since it is impossible to exhaust this dynamic in such a modest essay. The generalizations and unconventional readings that this book is obliged to carry out have to be recognized for their limits and prejudices, but there is no way to carry out such a project without working through them. Nevertheless, I hope that what I set out below will be of inspiration to scholars who might want to address the question of technology from both European and non-European perspectives, something that I believe is becoming increasingly necessary. Rather than presenting a formal method, I would like to explain three things that I seek to avoid. Firstly, asymmetry of concepts, where one starts with corresponding concepts in European philosophy and Chinese philosophy. For example, identifying the equivalents of techni and physis in Chinese culture. It is true that after decades of progress in translation and cultural communication, the terms of Western philosophy can find more or less corresponding translations in the Chinese language, but it is dangerous to take these as symmetrical relations, for the search for symmetry will end up obliging us to use the same concepts, or more precisely, to subsume two forms of knowledge and practice under predefined concepts. To start with, asymmetry also means an affirmation of difference, but not a difference without relation, e.g. mirror images, reflections, mirages, and to seek a convergence conditioned by the difference. Hence, in my inquiry into the question of technics in China, even if I use the word technics, readers should be aware of the linguistic constraints and must be prepared to open themselves to a different cosmological and metaphysical system. For these reasons, I do not use the usual translation of techni as gong or ji, which would turn our inquiries into mere empirical examples, but rather start with a systematic overview of qi and dao, terms which in turn cannot be reduced to product, ergon, and soul, psyche. This asymmetry is presupposed and methodologically mobilized in this book. Readers may find that on occasion I try to draw out similarities, but only so as to render visible the underlying asymmetry. The same thing goes for translating doctrines such as dualism and materialism. For example, it would be incorrect to understand yin-yang as a dualism in the same sense that we use this term in Europe. The latter generally refers to two opposing and discontinuous entities, mind, body, culture, nature, being, nothingness. This form of dualism is not dominant in China, and yin-yang are not conceived of as two discontinuous entities. Hence, in Chinese metaphysics, there is virtually no problem in recognizing that being comes from nothingness, as is already stated in the Taoist classics. In Europe, ex nihilo creation is the reserve of a divine power, since it is scientifically impossible. Ex nihilo nihil fit. It was not until Leibniz posed the question, why is there something instead of nothing, later taken up by Heidegger to explicate the meaning of being, that the question of being would be further clarified in Western philosophy. In more general terms, Chinese thinking tends to be concerned more with continuity and less with discontinuity. This continuity is constructed by relations as found, for example, in resonances between the heaven and the human musical instruments or the moon and flowers. As mentioned above, this is often referred to as correlative thinking. However, this discourse is developed by Grenet and later by A.C. Graham, who make use of structuralist anthropology to formulate the two corresponding entities as oppositions, for example, yin-yang. I prefer to call it a relational rather than correlative thinking because the correlative thinking described by the above-mentioned sinologists, inspired by structuralist anthropology, is always mobilized in an attempt to systematize in order to finally present static structures. Footnote. Readers interested in how a structuralist reading is performed can refer to B.I. Schwartz, The World of Thought in Ancient China, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 1985, Chapter 9, Correlative Cosmology, The School of Yin and Yang, where Schwartz analyzes the school using a method similar to Levi-Strauss's primitive science of the concrete. End of footnote. This relational thinking is in fact more open than this might suggest, since it is more dynamic. It does indeed include a correlative mode of association, meaning that one natural phenomenon can be related to the other according to shared common categories in the cosmology, for example, the Wu Xing, 5 phrases or 5 movements. But it can also be political in the sense that there is a correlation between seasonal change, as the expression of the will of the heaven, and the policy of the state. For example, one should avoid executing criminals in the springtime. Finally, it can also be subtle and poetic in the sense that the heart is able to detect this subtle resonance between natural phenomena in order to reach the Tao, something that is especially true in the Xin school of Neo-Confucianism. Secondly, I avoid setting out from isolated concepts as if they were static categories, a method practiced by many sinologists, but which seems to me rather problematic because it is also unconsciously imposing a sort of cultural essentialism. Concepts can never exist independently. A concept exists in relation to other concepts. This is especially so in Chinese thinking, which, as we have said, is fundamentally a relational thinking. Therefore, instead of comparing two concepts, I try to take a systematic view and to open up the possibility of locating a genealogy of the concept within the system. As we shall see, when we focus on the relation between Tao and Qi, we must consider both their historical separation and their reunification as the lineage through which we can project a philosophy of technology in China. I hope that the case of China can serve as an example to illustrate this difference and hence contribute toward a pluralism of technicity. Thirdly, I would like to distance this work from post-colonial critiques. This is not at all to say that post-colonial theory is not taken into account here, but rather that I aim to provide a supplement that makes up for what post-colonial theory tends to disregard. The strength of post-colonial theory, it seems to me, is that it effectively reformulates the question of power dynamics as narratives and consequently argues for other or different narratives. However, this might also be regarded as one of its weaknesses. since it tends to ignore the question of technology, a question which, I would argue, cannot be reduced to one of narratives. Indeed, it is dangerous to try to operate such a reduction, since doing so involves acknowledging the material conditions without understanding the material significance of these conditions, just as qi was considered to be an essential to Tao during the social and political reform in China after the Qing dynasty. Thus, the approach adopted here departs from that of post-colonial critique in order to advance towards a materialist critique. This materialism is not one that opposes spirit and matter, though. Rather, it aims to foreground material practice and material construction in order to attain a cosmological and historical understanding of the relation between the traditional and the modern, the local and the global, the Orient and the Occident. End of introduction.